Happy New Year! It is officially 2019. Hello everyone, my name is Lindsay and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing what is one of my absolute favorite videos to film, and that is my favorite books of 2018. These are my top 10 favorite books of 2018, but that does not mean that they came out in 2018. I have a wide variety of release years and genres and all kinds of things, so I'm excited to get started. Before I do, I just want to mention that if I have a full review of any of the books that I'm going to talk about in this video, they will all be linked down in the description. And before I jump into my official top 10 of 2018, I do have a couple of honorable mentions because I have no self-control, and there are a couple of books that didn't quite make it into the top 10 but that I liked a lot and I still want to just briefly mention. The first of those is Far From the Tree by Robin Benway. This is a book I read very early on in the year and it stuck with me pretty much all year long. I really enjoyed it. It's about three adopted siblings who recently find out that they have the same birth mother, and so they go on a search to find their birth family, and it's just so heartwarming and fun, and it has a lot of diversity and it's very powerful, and I just really enjoyed it, and it just didn't quite make it into the top 10 but something that I still really loved. And my other honorable mention is One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I loved this book so much. It was the very first Taylor Jenkins Reid book that I read this year, and it's kind of what started my love for Taylor Jenkins Reid. I have a rule about my favorite books of the year that if I love more than one book by a certain author, I will just pick my favorite of those because I want each spot to be represented by a different author. But if I broke my own rules and put just my overall top 10 favorite books, this one would definitely make the cut. So now that that's out of the way, let's jump into my top 10 favorite books of 2018. And as always, I'm gonna start with number 10 and work my way up to number 1. And number 1 is, of course, my favorite book of the year. Starting with number 10, this is actually the very first book I read in 2018. I started my year off with a bang. I gave my first read of 2018 5 stars, and that was Buffering: Unshared Tales of a Life Fully Loaded by Hannah Hart. I have been a huge fan of Hannah Hart and My Drunk Kitchen for a very long time. I've been watching her channel for as long as I can remember, and at the start of the year I decided to pick up her memoir, and I listened to the audiobook because Hannah narrates it herself, and I just loved it. It was so personal and emotional, and it added a lot to what I know of Hannah that I didn't ever think that she would share with us. And so I really appreciated this book. I appreciated what she chose to share. I appreciated how she chose to tell the story, and I just overall really enjoyed it. Going from my very first read of the year to my very last read of the year, number 9 is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy, and it's a book that I've owned for so long and just never picked up. But then I finally decided to in December, and I finished it just under the wire. I finished it on December 29th, and I'm so glad that I read this book because it is fantastic. This is the first book in a trilogy set in a world where the magic system is based on the ingestion and use of different metals, and some people have the ability to harness the power of one metal, and then there are a rare few people who have the ability to harness the power of all the metals. And the main character of this story is a girl named Ven who has recently discovered that she has the power to harness all the metals, and she gets swept up in this crazy heist with this notorious crew leader named Kelsier, who is also a Mistborn, and the story unfolds from there. I loved this book more than I can put into words. It's clever, it's smart, it's intricate, the magic system is so complex. I was just impressed from start to finish. I loved this book, and I really wish that I'd read it sooner because I could have been in this world a lot longer than I was. I could have been enjoying these books a lot sooner than I'm going to be because I waited so long to read it. But I'm glad that I finally did. I'm glad that I finished it just under the wire in 2018, and I'm glad that it's made my favorites of the year list. Number 8 on my list is a book that came as a complete surprise to me because it's actually a poem, and I didn't expect to love it as much as I did, and that was Said the Shotgun to the Head by Saul Williams. This whole book, it's like 180 pages, is one poem, and it's got a lot of like interesting like mixed text, and the way the formatting is, it's just really cool, and it's all about racism in America and gun violence and systemic oppression, and just a lot of things are in this. It tackles a lot, but it's very hard-hitting and powerful. I read it for the 7 in 7 readathon earlier this year, and I just really loved it. I read it all in one go, and I was just blown away by how hard it hit me. I definitely want to reread it. I want to annotate it. I want to write all kinds of stuff in it, and I want to recommend it to you because I think that it's an important thing. I know it's a poem and that's kind of weird. Poetry isn't really my thing, but this was really good, and I am glad that I read it this year. Number 7 is another short little book, and that is Dear Ijewele, or A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is a letter that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie wrote to her friend, and then they just published it as a little book, and it's just 15 suggestions about how to raise a child as a feminist. I listened to the audiobook of this one morning when I was driving to work, and I just really enjoyed it. There were quite a few passages in this book that really hit hard for me, and while I don't know that this is anything groundbreaking or new, this has a lot of basic feminist ideas in it, I liked it, and it really got me thinking about some things that I hadn't thought of before, and just made me kind of realize that I need to be doing some things differently in my feminist lifestyle. So I'm glad that I read this, and I think this is a book that I will continuously reread, and it's another book that I want to just go through and annotate and mark up all my favorite passages. I just really enjoyed it, and it definitely had to be on my favorites of the year list. Number 6 on my list is a book that I read fairly recently, and I really loved it. It's a book that shocked me because it's another poetry prose style book that I didn't expect to love, but did, and that was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is about a young girl living in New York City. She has a very religious mother, but she herself is struggling with her relationship with the church and with God, and she is also really into slam poetry, but her parents don't approve of that, and she also meets a boy and starts falling in love for the first time, but her parents don't approve of that either, and so it's just about this girl coming of age and realizing who she really is and finding her place in the world, and I was just blown away by it. It is written in verse, which is something that I don't normally like. I don't normally connect with stories written in verse, but I loved this. I listened to this one on audiobook as well because Elizabeth Acevedo narrates the audiobook herself, and I think that's the only way to go. I mean, that's the way to consume the story, is by listening to the audiobook, because Elizabeth Acevedo knows how to read her own poetry, and it was just fantastic. I'm glad that I read this year, and I would definitely recommend it if you haven't picked it up yet. We're halfway there now, and number 5 on my list is a book that I really thought was going to be my favorite of the year. For the longest time after I finished this book, it was my favorite book that I read all year, and then I just read some really amazing books right at the end of the year that knocked it off of its spot. But yes, this book I really loved. Most of the year it was my top book of the year, and that was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first book in an adult fantasy trilogy called the Broken Earth Trilogy, and it's all about the movement of tectonic plates and geodes, and it's very hard to describe because it's very complex and intricate, but it's so interesting, and it's a book that I don't know that I would recommend doing a lot of research on before you read it. I think I would just go into it and pick it up and explore and discover the story for yourself. It switches between 3 different perspectives throughout the story, and you can tell as you're reading it that somehow these 3 perspectives are going to come together, but the way they do is so unexpected and just genius that I was in awe of this book. When I finished it, I was just so impressed by what N.K. Jemisin did with this story. I know she won the Hugo Award for all 3 installments of this trilogy, and after reading the first book, I can definitely tell you that that was well deserved, and I can only imagine that it's well deserved in the other 2 as well. So if this sounds at all like your thing, if you like adult fantasy and you haven't picked this book up yet, I don't know what you're doing, because it is just amazing, and I can't recommend it enough. Coming in at number 4 is another book that I read relatively recently. It's another nonfiction book, and that was Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates' memoir, but it's told in the form of a letter from father to son, and it's all about Ta-Nehisi Coates explaining to his son what it's like to grow up in a racist America, an America that doesn't value the importance of Black people and that continuously tries to push them down, and I loved this so much. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. This is a book that I feel like everybody needs to read, because even if it doesn't sound like something you'd enjoy, everybody can get something from this book. It is just powerful and moving and emotional. It made such an impact on me, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since I finished it, and so I can't do anything but recommend it to everybody. And it definitely had to make my favorites of the year list. I knew when I read it that it would, and I loved it. I just loved it so much, and so I would highly recommend it, as I would any of the books on this list, but this is my favorite nonfiction book of the year, so it's probably the book that I would recommend you read of all of these if you're into nonfiction. And now we're getting into the top 3, and it was very hard to put these in some kind of order. The one that I put in the number 3 spot is a book that I really thought was my favorite for a long time after I read it. Just like The Fifth Season, after this one knocked it off its spot. I thought this was going to be my favorite book of the year, and then December just ended up being an incredible reading month. Number 3 on my list is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the reason that One True Loves is not in the top 10, because this book blew me away. This book is about a journalist named Monique who is given the opportunity to sit down with the elusive and mysterious Evelyn Hugo, who was a very popular movie star in the 50s and 60s. She's got like an Elizabeth Taylor, Marilyn Monroe-esque type of personality. And she's never granted a journalist an interview. She's never told her life story. And then she contacts Monique and says that she will tell her everything and gives Monique the opportunity to write her biography. So the book is written in the way that Evelyn is telling Monique the story, and it feels very conversational. I listened to the audiobook of this one, so it felt like I was sitting in the room and Evelyn was telling me her story, and I just loved this so much. It's so hyped on BookTube, but I think the hype is incredibly well deserved because it is amazing. It really is worth all the hype. This is absolutely my favorite Taylor Jenkins Reid book. I've read all her books now, and this one is definitely my favorite. It taught me so much about life and about myself. I just feel like even if you don't think this book is your thing, you'll get something out of it because it's amazing. And it's like a book that teeters on the edge of romance chick lit and literary fiction, historical fiction. It's just got a lot of layers to it, and I loved it. I loved it so much, and it's definitely one of my favorite books that I've read this year. It's probably a book that I'll reread in the future. It's a book that will stick with me forever, and I can't recommend it enough. So the top 2 are books that I think are pretty interchangeable in terms of like how much I enjoyed them and where they would fall. These are both books I read in December, and when I did my December wrap-up, I ordered them differently, but when I sat down to make my favorites of the year list, number 1 was number 1 and this one was number 2. So coming in at number 2 is Nevermore, The Trials of Morgan Crow by Jessica Townsend. Surprise, surprise, this is a middle grade story about a girl named Morgan Crow who has grown up her whole life knowing that she is a cursed child, and on her 11th birthday she is going to die. But then her 11th birthday comes around and a crazy man named Jupiter North comes and sweeps her off to the magical land of Nevermore and gives her the opportunity to compete in the trials to gain entrance into the Wondrous Society. And it's just a bucket of fun. It's so whimsical and magical, and it's just great. I went into this not really thinking I was gonna like it that much because I'm not a huge fan of middle grade, but I came out of it having a new favorite book and knowing that this is a series that I will continue to revisit over and over. I will continue on with, and I really, really loved it. And finally, number 1, my favorite book of 2018, a complete shock to me because I really thought that Nevermore was gonna be number 1, but on further reflection, I loved this book so much, and that was Neverworld Wake by Marisha Pessl. This is a YA mystery thriller that I just don't want to tell you too much about. It's a book that I really think you need to go into knowing little to nothing. Your expectations need to be nothing at all, because this came as a complete surprise to me because I didn't know what it was about. I will say that this book follows a girl named Bee whose boyfriend dies a year before the start of the novel, and nobody knows exactly what happened. His death has always remained a mystery. And then a year later, the start of the book, she reunites with some old friends and they decide that they are going to figure out what happened to their friend. That's basically the story. A lot of other stuff happened. I mean, there's like a lot of interesting twists and turns. There's lots of elements to this book that you have to read and discover for yourself. But it's just so good. It's smart and it's entertaining. It keeps you on the edge of your seat. I didn't want to put it down. I wanted to find out what was going to happen next. I listened to the audiobook of this one and I finished it in just a couple of days because I could not stop listening. I was obsessed with this story. And while I mentioned in my December wrap-up that this was like number 2 and Nevermore was number 1, when I made my favorites of the year list, this one had to be number 1. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about it. It's a book that I think I could reread a dozen times and find something new in it every single time. I just loved this so much, and I'm so glad that I read it in 2018. I'm just glad that this book exists. I'm glad I read it. I hope that more people will read it. I just really, really loved it, and it has to be my favorite book of the year, without a doubt. So those are my favorite books of 2018. Believe me when I tell you that this list was as much a surprise to me as it probably is to you. I just love making this list. I love making this video because when I sit down and really think about the books that I loved, it's always a surprise which ones I loved more than others. Let me know down in the comments if you have read any of the books that I mentioned in this video and what you thought about them. Are some of these books also some of your favorites? I really love to know. Also, let me know some books that you loved in 2018, or maybe your favorite book that you read in 2018. I'd really love to know that as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.